promote the cause of liberty and the principles of enlightenment, both here and in your own
Oh, my sweet Lafayette, how I'm gonna miss you. You feel so good, Lafayette. Now I've come to greet you. Hello, my friends, I've come back again. I couldn't stay away. I was gone only a day, but I'm coming back.
Go up by the sound truck and come in. There's an entrance to escort him in.
Okay.
The Colonel Knox regiment. My name is Pete Riley, and I actually have to admit that I thought of this event. I came up with this idea from just being on a walk and seeing a Lafayette monument, a little marker that said how Lafayette was greeted in the town of Leicester, which is just down the road from here, and started thinking, wouldn't it be cool to do something for the bicentennial? And I did some reading, and I was then very pleased to find that there's the American Friends of Lafayette. And I joined them, and I was able to convince them we should do something about the bicentennial. And they asked me to help Julian, who's documenting the Lafayette Trail, and this was one of the sites that most impressed Julian. The president of France knows about the Ryder Tavern now.
To arrive here today, the Ryder Tavern in Charlton, Massachusetts, a place that actually saw the living, breathing Marquis de Lafayette, is a great honor for us. He was here, he ate here, he drank here, he greeted his fellow patriots here, and he was honored here. And we are honored to be here today in his memory.
If you would look behind you, you don't have to, but when you leave, look behind you, you'll see a beautiful building that has been restored. I'd like to tell you a little bit of the history behind this building. A long time ago, during the time of the visit of Lafayette in 1824, and just before, this was the Stafford Turnpike, meaning it was a major road. So you needed to travel this, and you needed to stop and rest. So they built taverns and way houses along the way. This is a federal tavern, and I'll tell you some history about it. First, I'd like to tell you why you had taverns. They were probably an extremely important part of the social fabric at that time. You needed a place to communicate with others. You could have a community gathering to listen to a speech. They called them lyceums at the time. So a renowned speaker from some part of the country would come in, and everybody would gather to listen to him. When the man you're going to honor today, he'll be showing up soon, I hope. When he came, it wasn't the Ryder Tavern. By then, the Ryders were out of the picture by a very short time, and it was Wilson's Coffee House. Yeah, that does emit a little bit of a chuckle sometimes because it doesn't sound as prestigious that Lafayette stopped at Wilson's Coffee House, but if you check the papers, he did indeed stop at Wilson's Coffee House.
If you think about the type of people that created the beginnings of the United States of America, people like Paul Revere and George Washington and Joseph Warren and Ben Franklin, these were all men of excellent character, and Lafayette was one of them. He was a Mason like all the rest. And it was these type of characteristics in men that brought them all together, and they created this country, and the organization was created based on the symbolism used by the stonemasons in the cathedrals in Europe, using that framework to take good men who want to become better men, and that's what brings us all together.
I am on a tour of the American states, a great return to my adoptive homeland. I have not been here for for many years, and as much has changed in my absence.
I'm going to tell you about the significance of the farewell tour to this country. On the invitation of Congress and President James Monroe, General Lafayette sailed from Le Havre, France, on the American merchant ship the Cadmus in July of 1824 for the United States, his adoptive home. Although he had last visited these shores in 1784 after the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the American Revolution, which he had shared the glory of winning on the battlefield. This visit, 40 years later, produced a fervent outpouring of affection from the American people for the last surviving Major General of the Continental Army. During his 13-month farewell tour, he visited all 24 states where he was celebrated and honored on an almost daily basis. He was called during this trip the nation's guest. So who was Lafayette, and why did his visit generate this outpouring of emotion that it did? Gilbert Dumotier de Lafayette was born to an aristocratic family in France on September 6, 1757 in the Auvergne region. He came from a long line of military figures. One of his ancestors fought in the Crusades, another was with Joan of Arc fighting against the British, and his father was killed in the 7 Years' War in 1759 by British artillery. Having received a classical education and being inspired by our revolution and its Republican ideals, Lafayette obtained a commission in the Continental Army from our representative in Paris, Silas Deane, and in April of 1777, he sailed on a ship provisioned with his own funds. He was one of the richest men in France, to America. He was not yet 20 years old. He was commissioned as a major general, and he met Washington in Philadelphia in the summer of 1777, where he joined his ragtag army. In his earliest involvement in the American Revolution, Lafayette displayed prudent judgment in war councils and courage on the battlefield, in particular at the Brandywine battlefield, where he was wounded on behalf of the American cause.
I was imprisoned. I was imprisoned during the great tumult of the French Revolution and the wars between France and Austria. I was stationed with the French army under my command along the eastern frontier when I received word that a warrant had been issued for my arrest and that I would stand before a revolutionary tribunal, which I knew could mean only one thing, and it was the guillotine. And so I became an émigré. I left France and presented myself for asylum in the Austrian Netherlands. But remember that the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was a princess of Austria, and it was the monarchy of Austria that held me responsible for what was befalling her. And so they put me in prison, in a series of prisons in which I was held for almost 5 years to the day. In the year preceding my release, it was my wife and daughters who voluntarily imprisoned themselves with me in my cell. Unable to win my release by other means, they received dispensation from the Austrian emperor to share my imprisonment. And this perhaps got enough attention from those in support of young General Bonaparte, who at that moment was making a name for himself in Italy. And he won my release in 1797, though I was still an émigré and unable to enter France for 2 more years. And so even though I was no longer a prisoner, I lived in exile.
Now, 43 years after Yorktown and 40 years after his last visit to the United States, Lafayette, sometimes known as Hero of Two Worlds, was returning to his adoptive land, America. The interim period had not been so kind to him. One of the leaders of the early phases of the French Revolution, he was the one who principally wrote the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which became part of the Constitution. He was also the head of the National Guard of Paris, and for a year or two, the most powerful man in France. He was forced into exile when the Jacobins took over. He was imprisoned for 5 years, and ultimately, when he was freed by Napoleon's armies, he was still banned. He couldn't return to France. He went anyway into retirement at his chateau, his wife's chateau, east of Paris, where he served after a period of time in the Chamber of Deputies, in particular in 1815 and again from 1818 to 1823. In the election of 1824, he and others on the so-called liberal side, left side, they actually sat on the left side of the chamber, were defeated. Thus, President Monroe's invitation, which came in 1824, came at a propitious moment, and Lafayette decided to accept it and sailed for America. His was a party of four: his son, named George Washington Lafayette, his private secretary, Auguste Levasseur, and his valet, whose name was Sebastian Wagner, or Bastien. Levasseur, a young French officer who had been involved in conspiratorial activities against the crown in France in the early 1820s, was engaged to send dispatches back to Lafayette's liberal friends in France, showing the success of the American Revolution on the theory that when this became known, the French would be more likely to follow our example. Levasseur, he also kept a journal of the trip, and he wrote a book in 1829, the book that I translated under the title Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825. So why did the nation's guest engender such a great outpouring of love and admiration during his visit? There were a number of reasons. First, the time was right. It was the era of good feelings, James Monroe's mostly successful presidency. It was a time of great optimism and pride in the successes that the liberated American colonies had achieved. These included the tremendous pride in population growth, along with the growth of manufacturing, agriculture, commerce, the arts and sciences, and the spread of public education. It was thought that the Republican institutions that the Revolution ushered in were the most important reasons for this great progress that America had made. Thus, there was an intense feeling of gratitude towards the military and political leaders who had won the Republic. Moreover, preparations for America's Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, had begun. At this time of introspection and retrospection and celebration, entered General Lafayette, who had risked his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, and spilled his blood at Brandywine for America's cause. Unlike the great American early leaders, whose early brilliance had been somewhat dimmed by controversial political careers, John Adams, Jefferson, and Madison all fall into this category, Lafayette burst on the American scene with his reputation largely intact and unsullied. As reflected in many of the welcoming speeches addressed to Lafayette, Americans were aware of the vicissitudes of his long career, his role in the French Revolution, his imprisonment in the imperial dungeon in Olmütz, Austria, and his more recent support for European and South American revolutions, and they viewed Lafayette's actions sympathetically and with approval. Thus, his 1824-1825 visit became a renewal of his love affair with the American people. So that's kind of a summation of what the farewell tour was about and why I think he was greeted the way he did. And as will be described by my friend Dorothea Jensen shortly, you'll see some examples of the love affair between Lafayette and the American people. Thank you.
And everywhere I have gone, I have been welcomed by the townspeople and the Americans who remember and are so grateful and hospitable in acknowledging my service in their revolution for independence.
I wanted to tell you just a little bit about how I found out about the farewell tour. Now, it started out with me making a boast. I boasted that I had shaken hands with someone who had shaken hands with Geronimo, which I thought was pretty cool. But then a voice came from the front of the crowd, and she said, well, I have been kissed by someone who was kissed by someone who was kissed by Lafayette. Now, the first thing I did was run up to her and say, right here, Rita. So I don't know how many kiss by, but I have been, just so you know. And I asked her how this came about, and she said this was an elderly woman who was probably about the same age I am now, so she wasn't that elderly. But her great-grandmother, as a little girl, had been selected by her town of Northampton, Massachusetts, to present a posy to Lafayette when he came through on his farewell tour in 1824. And so she gave him the posy, and he kissed her on the cheek, which in the words of the time would have been, he bussed her on the cheek. So I ended up writing a book about a young girl who lives in my town in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, who meets Lafayette when he comes through on his tour, and this meeting and the buss he gives her on the cheek changes her life in significant ways. Now, before I go on, I just want to sum up the general tone of what happened when he arrived in towns by quoting just a little bit from the Massachusetts Spy newspaper about his reception in Worcester. Now, I'm very fond of this description because all of my family was right around Worcester, and I am sure that some of them went to Worcester to see him. So at least indirectly, I went to Worcester too. And this was the way it was described. He was received with a general burst of joy from many, many citizens. And I just thought, burst of joy, what a great way to describe the way people received him. They were so excited about seeing him. And why was there such a burst of joy? Well, Alan has touched on this, and I have a couple of other things to add in that probably are very similar to his. One was, of course, he was a living link, was the most important era of our history at that point, the American Revolution. And of course, as we all know, he was a very good friend of George Washington, and George Washington had been dead for 25 years. So it was like reaching back, talking to someone who knew George Washington very, very well. He also was friendly with a number of the other founding fathers, so it wasn't just Washington. Now remember that at the time of Lafayette's farewell tour, the oldest generation still had personal memories of the Revolution, and their children, who were middle-aged by then, had heard some of these stories, but perhaps their grandchildren didn't know that much about the Revolution or about Lafayette. And there's some indication that in addition to honoring Lafayette and observing the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the war, there was also some thought of introducing the youngest generation to the spirit of 1776, a little bit like Hamilton is doing today. It's attracting the kids and engaging their interest. So how did towns receive the nation's guest? Here's a short description from my book about when he entered Concord, New Hampshire. Concord was filled to the brim with nearly 40,000 people, more than 10 times the town's normal population. 2 cannons on the hill back of the State House kept firing away, and the church bell of Old North Church rang and rang and rang. Ladies and little girls showed up with their arms absolutely full of roses to bestow on the nation's guest. Then, when the procession with the man himself arrived, there was such a frenzy as I have never heard or seen in my entire life. Lafayette arrived in a barouche drawn by 6 white horses, followed by a stagecoach carrying his son and his secretary. Then came a musical band with fifes and drums and clarinets. Marching behind them were 20 companies of New Hampshire militia. 20! It was quite a sight, I tell you. So many, many towns had parades such as these, and in the larger towns they were even more elaborate, with cavalry, marshals, and what the newspapers called cavalcades of carriages full of leading citizens, and also carrying veterans of the American Revolution. Indeed, these veterans of the American Revolution had a huge emotional impact wherever Lafayette was. Here's what happened in Worcester, a scene doubtless repeated in all 24 states. Quote, "The gray-headed soldiers of the Revolution, in their impatience to salute their old comrade in arms, pressed up to the coach as it passed along and extended their arms to embrace the object of their affection. It was a scene never to be forgotten, and many an eye was wet with tears." Of course, the general's visit was greeted by much more than just tearful remembrances. There were plenty of joyful sights and events as well. The towns where he visited were decorated to welcome him with arches, evergreens, flags, and celebratory banners. There were gala balls held where ladies attended in their best finery and wore ribbons or gloves imprinted with Lafayette's face. And this actually led to some humorous moments when Lafayette wasn't too keen to kiss his own face, so, but that's another story. Souvenirs such as these ribbons and gloves, along with dishes, fans, fabric, and all kinds of other things, were sold on a grand scale, all emblazoned with images of the general. Just as here at Ryder Tavern, there were dinners and banquets held, some small, some very large, such as the 4,000 who banqueted after the dedication of the Bunker Hill Memorial, to which, by the way, no ladies were invited, although some were allowed to attend the dedication itself. There were endless reception lines, poems read, plays staged, songs sung, and oratorios performed. Many of these were written especially to honor Lafayette and his service to America. And in one of them, New Hampshire was referred to as the Granite State for the very first time. So we Granite Staters are very happy about that. Children, like my friend Rita's great-grandmother, waved flags, strewed flowers, presented posies, and everybody was waving handkerchiefs and flags, that kind of thing. Now, we don't have any of those here today, but we do have the most important element that made Lafayette's tour such an amazing event, and that is the mobs of people who cheered him wildly. Now, it seems to me that this was much more important than the flowery speeches of the local officials. In fact, to me, it seems like the most important part of Lafayette's visit. So this is going to be your role, people. We need you to provide the burst of joy. So let us practice just a little bit, okay? When I direct you, I want you to say, "Hurrah for Lafayette, hurrah for the nation's guest." Let's try it once, okay? Hurrah for Lafayette, hurrah for the nation's guest.
General, your aid and that of your fellow Frenchmen in our struggle for independence created a bond between the United States and France which lasts to this day. Twice in the last century, France was beleaguered and America came to her aid, invoking your name. God willing, we will never have a war again like the war that these brave individuals in front of us served in. Many of their comrades lay in graves in France, and many Frenchmen lay in graves in the United States. I'd like you to join us in thanking them for their sacrifices that have preserved freedom in both our countries. If you could please go over to meet with, and I'll give you the names as we go across. Now we would like to take a moment to greet different groups similar to the groups that would have met him, some would have met him at that time. The first group would be the Colonial Craftsmen of Colonial Massachusetts. Now the spokesman, David Newcomb, would like to say a few words.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon again, General Lafayette. I'd like to introduce those that have come on my suite today, accompanying me. We have Right Worshipful Jack Mulhall and Right Worshipful Charlie Katsanos over there. Worshipful Ted Hatch, the ladies of the distaff side, Diana Hatch, Diane Newcomb, Jackie Katsanos, and I am honored to have a letter from the Grand Master. Oh, excuse me. We have our Senior Grand Warden, Right Worshipful Fred Dobson, and our Junior Grand Warden, Right Worshipful Michael Jarzabek, and the Grand Pursuant Ed Lavoy, representing our Grand Lodge. And it is my honor to bring with me a letter from the Grand Master of Masons in Massachusetts, and I'll be honored to read that to you at this time. Dear Brother Lafayette, on behalf of the Masons of Massachusetts, let me welcome you back on the 194th anniversary celebration of your 1824 visit. Like Most Worshipful John Abbott, I am honored and pleased to welcome you on your brief call to Boston. We recall with pride your return to Boston on June 7th, 1825, where you and Most Worshipful Brother Abbott participated in laying the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument in Charlestown to commemorate the 50th anniversary of that battle. Later, our brethren were able to honor you at a special communication of our Grand Lodge. The apron you wore at these events has been carefully laid up with the records and archives of our Grand Lodge. The Lafayette apron was worn again at the 100-year anniversary of the Bunker Hill Battle by the acting Deputy Grand Master, Right Worshipful and Dr. Winslow Lewis. I extend to you an invitation to visit our Grand Lodge again. I hope that you will be free to rededicate the Bunker Hill Monument with my successor on a future anniversary. It would be an historic opportunity for you to wear the very same apron. Let me personally thank you for your service. You have brought much honor to the fraternity and to our country. We salute you and your continued dedication as a brother and a friend. Cordially and fraternally, Most Worshipful Paul Fulton Gleason, Grand Master.
Brother Lafayette, a toast to you, our brother. We know that you have brought pleasure to yourself and honor to the fraternity and honor to our country, and we salute you. Brother Lafayette, huzzah!
Huzzah.
Huzzah!
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, my brothers.
The next group that I would like to come up to meet the General are the Daughters of the American Revolution, General Ebenezer Learned Chapter, Oxford, Mass.
Enchanté. Enchanté.
And now the Colonel Henry Knox Regimental Color Guard. the veterans of foreign wars.
General, I'd like to take a minute here to thank you for your service to our great country, the United States of America. Right from the beginning, France was there, and I can tell you 166 years later, in the grand desert of Saudi Arabia, as our units were stationed at Camp Bastille in Rafah, Saudi Arabia, with French Marines, that we were toasting your name 166 years later as we were sharing each other's rations in the desert. The men and women that you see sitting over here, World War II, also Normandy, all the way to the Battle of the Bulge, and I think every single one of them. Bud Holland landed in Normandy on June 9th, fought in the hedgerows as an artilleryman, and went all the way to the Battle of the Bulge. So on behalf of the veterans of foreign wars in the United States of America, thank you so much for your service to our country.
Now the American Friends of Lafayette.
General Lafayette, as the president of an organization that was founded in 1932 to honor your memory, I welcome you back on this august occasion.
The honor is mine, monsieur.
Now the sons of the American Revolution.
Mon General, it is grand seeing you on this occasion. It was wonderful that my men and your men, and we salute you for your service to us at Valley Forge. We salute you for your service in the final Battle of Yorktown, and of all that your countrymen gave to our American Revolution. And most of all, we thank you for being a citizen of America. God bless you, sir.
You as well, monsieur. I am honored by your service, and you're welcome.
And lastly, the American Legion Post 391.
Honored by your service. Merci, monsieur. Humbled by your service, monsieur.
This has just been a wonderful occasion. Glad to see so many people from not only Charlton but surrounding areas. It's an honor to have Lafayette back here. A couple of years ago, the wife and I took a cruise down the Rhine River, and one of the places we stopped was a Como Pocket, which was a big battlefield south of the Battle of the Bulge. And there we're buried, along with a lot of American soldiers, including a bunch of French paratroopers who fought alongside us. And in that area, Audie Murphy also won the Medal of Honor, and there's a little plaque standing there. Very humbling, very humbling. Again, welcome to Charlton, Mass. And good luck in the future, and we hope to see you back in 2024, and I hope I'm still alive to see you.
If I'm alive at 160, monsieur. Monsieur Jefferson is indeed a great friend, and our friendship truly took root during the years that he spent in Paris. He was a frequent guest at the household of myself and my wife in Paris. We collaborated together on la Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which we promulgated in 1789 in Paris. And it is true that Monsieur Jefferson enlightened though he may be, is an owner of slaves, something that I find incompatible with the notion of a free and equal society to which both the Americans and indeed the French should aspire. It has always been my intention to convince both Monsieur Jefferson and Monsieur Washington and a number of the other founders of the American Republic to live up to the words in Monsieur Jefferson's Declaration that all men are created equal, and to make steps to free their slaves and to integrate them within a free society. Indeed, the passions on display during these election campaigns that I have witnessed are not quite what the founders may have expected or indeed intended when the Constitution was ratified so many years ago. I have at times felt a bit distraught at how our citizens seem divided against one another when His Excellency General Washington himself warned against the dangers of factions in politics. However, Monsieur, I am confident that the ties which bind all American citizens to their institutions, to their cities, to their very communities and families for whom they have fought and bled and died and sacrificed so much, that the example should be set by our leaders when this election is concluded, that we are still one people and shall remain so, and shall remain united in spite of any election.
So just for a moment, let's have it be 1824. Among us are veterans of the Revolution and the first generation of people to be citizens of the United States of America for their entire lives. They bicker about what the Constitution really means and are engaged in one of the most bitter presidential contests in the history of our country, as the office would pass to a president who was not one of the founding fathers. But on this day, they put their differences aside to celebrate Lafayette, a hero of both the American and French revolutions, who still has one more revolution in him. And they celebrate the shared idea that governments are established to serve the people. We may think that their concept of who the people were is too narrow, but if we see a little further, it is because we stand on their shoulders. So let's not congratulate ourselves too much. Peter would like to thank everyone who has come out for this event, the first in what we hope will be many events leading up to the bicentennial of Lafayette's 1824-1825 time as the nation's guest. He would like to particularly thank the veterans who have come out, too numerous to mention within my allotted time, but I think they would not mind if I single out Lieutenant Dorothy Taft Barry, who nursed soldiers wounded in the Battle of the Bulge. Lieutenant Barry? Just raise, give us a wave. Thank you very much. And then there are people sometimes least appreciated, our elected officials. And for them, I will pick one from our history. John Quincy Adams won the presidency in 1824 and was defeated for re-election in 1828. People in his town asked him if it would be beneath their dignity, his dignity, would it be beneath his dignity for a former president to represent them in Congress? He answered that if president would be honored to serve as selectman of the town if the people would elect him. He served in Congress 18 years after being president, making the congressman who thought it was just fine for people to own other people nervous every time he rose to speak. He died on the floor of the House and was graciously eulogized by his adversaries, who had voted to censor him for bringing anti-slavery petitions before them. Thank you all. I'm out of time.
Pastor Jim Chase. General Lafayette, the inhabitants of Charlton hold in grateful remembrance the very important services which you, sir, have rendered their beloved country. They cordially unite with their fellow citizens throughout the Union in the heart-cheering congratulations excited by your recent arrival in America and visit through the States. Accept, sir, our assurance of a hearty welcome and the expression of our best wishes for your personal happiness, and God's blessing be upon you. Amen. And now, please be seated. As was the day that he visited in 1824, we shall replicate that now. He will meet a number of dignitaries and groups, and just for a moment, he will say hello to them. They will greet him, and I will announce each as they come up. But before that I would like to tell the General that the country loves and respects you, and is so glad to hear you are able to make it back here again. The first person would be Senator Ann Goby. Good move. Is that low enough?
I got my bus. Did you notice that? Thank you, General. It's wonderful to have you here today and hearing about your early life. You obviously were someone of great wealth. As a young man, you could have stayed in France and lived a very comfortable life, and instead chose to come somewhere where you saw people that were trying to break off the bonds of tyranny and to respect the rights of man. And I'm looking at some of our veterans that are here today, and of course the other veterans that are in the audience who did the same thing, to go to countries that they never knew, to help a people they never knew. I have the great fortune in serving in the Senate. And one thing that in the state Senate in Massachusetts, I am always under the watchful eye of General Lafayette. It's the only bust of a foreigner in the entire State House. But you know, it's wonderful when you see the history and the great history of the United States and this wonderful friendship that has lasted for so many years between the United States, the Americans, and the French. And so it's wonderful to have you here today. I'm looking forward, Julian, with Representative Duran and Representative Frost, to work on the Lafayette Trail and to make sure that we get some state legislation on that, to have that trail. And so we'll be working with you coming up over the next several months. So again, General, it's an honor to have you here with us today, and thank you.
And the Marquis de Lafayette was the greatest gift that France ever gave us, although they gave us sea power. They gave us weapons, they gave us muskets, they gave us armies. The Marquis de Lafayette, who was and is also an American citizen, was, with the possible exception of George Washington, the greatest hero of our American Revolution. And to rededicate his memory here today is something that we are committed to do, and we are pleased to be here.
Julian Isher, who is from France. I had met Julian when he came here a little while back to set up the tour, the reunion of the tour. Julian is a former French consulate staff member, and I'd like to introduce him to General Lafayette.
Yeah, as Frank mentioned, I was here at the Tavern last year trying to get evidence about the stops that Lafayette made across Massachusetts. So I came here, and I have to say, the greatest time, so that was fantastic. We found a lot of artifacts, and local people were very supportive, so it's a great pleasure for me to be back here. But what I want to say is that the tour of Lafayette in 1824 is as much about the people as it is about government, okay? And here at the Tavern, I think it epitomizes very well this second component, the fact that everywhere where Lafayette went, essentially, there was a hustle and bustle went on everywhere. So it's a great instance of what happened. So I look forward in the future to working with the state legislature again to try to promote signage across the state and have some markers designating, memorializing the roads that Lafayette traveled across Massachusetts and different states as well. So I'd just like to finish by saying that French-American friendship is a great framework. I think it's pretty unique around the world, and I think it's important that we maintain this framework. Again, Lafayette was mentioned in 1918 in France, when the Americans came. On 4th of July 1918, Mr. Stanton, aide of Mr. General Pershing, went on the grave of Lafayette and said, Lafayette, nous voilà, Lafayette, we are here. There was a Lafayette Escadrille during World War I, formed by volunteers from America as well as from France. So we go way back, our two countries, and I think it's important that we maintain this framework. So once again, thanks for turning out, and enjoy the rest of your day.
The people who came out to greet Lafayette in 1824 put aside their differences for the whole day to celebrate the hero of two worlds. Their fragile experiment in government by the people was in some regards under siege. Lafayette in France was not himself so universally popular. He faced a Bourbon restoration that was moving away from the constitutional monarch. Less than 2 weeks later, after Lafayette's stop here, Louis XVIII, younger brother of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette Louis, you know that one, would die childless with his brother Charles X succeeding. And Charles hoped to restore the Ancien regime, bring things back to the way they were. Icons of the Republican Revolution, the tricolor flag and the Marseillaise anthem were illegal. And the American experiment seemed in jeopardy, our experiment. Even though people who helped write the Constitution were still alive, there was vigorous dispute about what it meant and exactly what you could and couldn't do under it. The 1824 election was very bitter, settled by the House of Representatives. They went with John Quincy Adams. Jackson was not happy, and many saw it as a corrupt bargain. Some of the children and grandchildren of the people here this day in 1824 would go to early graves in places like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Vicksburg, as the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln was met with secession and not the same resignation, understanding, and willing to wait 4 more years for a different outcome that supporters had shown to Adams. And I'd like to close by saying President Lincoln made an appeal to all people in his country in his first inaugural address when he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." And now a last word from General Lafayette.
Thank you, monsieur. This is a truly remarkable vocal amplification device. It is perhaps an invention of your ingenious Dr. Franklin. No? Mes amis, I am deeply touched and warmed by this show of affection and of welcome that you have received me with here in Massachusetts. Among the many happy memories which have traveled with me since the days of your revolution, there are 3 perhaps that stand out more than most. And remember that when I arrived upon your shores, already was I convinced that the success of your revolution was inextricably linked from the well-being of all peoples and all nations. The first of these momentous days was the day in the spring of 1778 when news reached Valley Forge that the good Dr. Franklin had been successful on his mission in France and that the King Louis XVI had signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. Not a year later, 2 years later, the second memory that I remember from this time was the immense joy with which I could tell General Washington in Morristown, New Jersey, arriving in Boston Harbor, running straight into his arms with the news that General de Comte de Rochambeau was trailing in my wake with thousands of men and ships of the line with cannons for the American war effort. And then finally, the conclusion that I knew this alliance was destined for at the Battle of Yorktown, when the Americans and the French fought bravely and valiantly side by side in the crowning glory that sealed American independence from England. But this victory was not complete when the shooting stopped, mes amis. Because when the English were made to surrender, they marched betwixt two columns of the victorious soldiers, the French upon one side, the Americans upon the other. And the surrendering English would look only to the French. They did not wish to acknowledge that they had been defeated by an alliance that included these upstart colonists which had previously, so recently, been their subjects. No, mes amis, this would be an incomplete victory until not only the French and the Americans knew the strength of their alliance, but the English and the whole world as well. And so I instructed my musicians to play a different song, one which used to be sung to taunt the Americans, but which had in recent times become more of a rallying cry for our side. And it is perhaps still sung today. Yum pam pada, yum pam pada, yum pam 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 pada, yum pam pada, ram pam pada, ram pam 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 pada, Yankee Doodle, etc., etc., etc. When the English soldiers heard this tune coming from our musicians, one by one their eyes were diverted to the Americans. Then and only then, mes amis, was our victory in Yorktown complete. Mes chers amis, citoyens et patriotes de Massachusetts, je vous remercie de tout mon cœur, de tout mon esprit. Je vous souhaite tous et toutes une très agréable continuation de votre journée. Merci beaucoup.
Quand de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, l'étendard sanglant élevé. L'étendard sanglant élevé. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes